Hey, everybody. My name is Kyle Kinberger. I'm the National Sales Manager for HMR Funding, and we're really happy that everybody could join us today. We've been doing, these installments of webinars and hitting on various topics every couple of months, and they really seem to be a really good thing for a lot of the attorneys who join in, and very informative on particular topics. And so this particular installment is no different. The way it came about is we, in the field and throughout the country, seem to be fielding, questions week in, week out. Once, somebody has an injured case and they've had all of the medical done in a particular case, the question usually turns to, do you all have access to any life care planners? Or, hey, I'm not really familiar with any life care planners for this particular injury that I have. Do you all have anybody that you could recommend? And those conversations really lead to, a lot of different topics on, hey, are life care planners only necessary for my catastrophic cases? Can I use them on a case where I've only got, a $500,000 policy or a $250,000? How much does that cost? How in depth is it? What's the trial prep leading up to it? And so because it kept coming up, we felt it pertinent to host a webinar, and we were fortunate enough to get Dr. Harvey Jacobs, who's based out of Richmond, Virginia, to agree to join us and share, his expertise. He's a licensed clinical psychologist. He's a certified life care planner, and we're excited to listen to the presentation today and get some of the information he's got. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Harvey Jacobs.
Thank you, Kyle, and I thank everybody who's joined us on the webinar today. Just for starting, a couple of disclosures. I'm an independent practitioner, and in developing this presentation, the information reflects my own opinions and understanding of the field. And it's great to associate with HMR Funding to provide you with this information, but otherwise I have no other obligations or associations with them. So with that, let's get on. So what is a life care plan? This is a definition from the International Academy of Life Care Planners. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but it talks about public standards of practice, comprehensive assessment, data analysis and research, organizing information into a concise plan. So what does that really mean? Well, what it really means is something that's consistent with what we find in tort, how to make a person whole again, and that's from some index event and how we do that over time. So here's an individual, we'll focus on the father and his normal daily routine, and then he faces quite a catastrophic index event. And then the issue is what is the recovery going to be like? Perhaps for this person, he'll be fortunate that it's a catastrophic but acute episode and we have a full recovery. Or the person may make a pretty good recovery over time, but continue to have some challenges that they face that need to be addressed. Or it can be a situation of devastating issues, and there's a lot of dynamic issues that are going on in the person's life for the rest of their life that need to be addressed. So when we develop life care plans, they're based on the evaluee. That's what we call the individual who has experienced the index event, or your client. But we take a look at their past, present, and predictive future. And I'll talk a little bit about how we come up with predictive future as well. Now, there are many different venues for life care plans. You can see various insurance venues, government venues, and other private funds. We're going to focus today on forensic issues, and we'll go into more detail. So life care plans follow established standards, and that's critical. That's especially critical in forensic cases. So there are not plaintiff life care plans or defendant life care plans. A life care planner might be hired by either bar, but their job is to educate the courts or the decision makers. Now, that doesn't mean that different attorneys engage life care planners differently. Customarily, plaintiff life care plans, or plaintiffs are hiring life care planners to put together a comprehensive report of all the things that we're going to talk about On occasion, defense will hire a life care planner for the same thing, or they might hire a life care planner to dissect and critique the plaintiff life care plan for purposes of mediation or in court or those types of situations. There's a number of key considerations I want to talk about today. I have a lot of information. I'm going to touch on some aspects of it. But time, it takes time to develop a good life care plan. I can't tell you the number of episodes when I get a call saying, hey, doctor, I need a life care plan. Well, when do you need it? Can you have it done in 2 weeks or can you have it done in a month? Really can't. There's a lot of time and a lot of deliberative work. Communication. There needs to be communication not only between the life care planner and the attorney and his or her office, but between the experts and the other people involved. There's integration of a tremendous amount of data, from medical records to interviews with people to the cost and charge data and the like. And there are specific foundations that need to be followed in conducting the life care plan process and then the reports. And this is critical in terms of whether a court is going to accept the report in the life care plan or not. It's critical for Daubert standards and things like that. Costs can vary according to the size of the life care plan, the amount of information, how interesting the person might be. We may have to look at premorbid issues or other types of issues, but through communication, we can address those costs. And I'll also talk about some non-life care plan options at the end of the talk that you might need to consider as well. And then individuality. No two life care plans are alike. People may have similar impairments, but as you'll see, they may be very different. In terms of time, how much time? I'd like you to consider at least 6 months. I'd like you to actually consider engaging a life care planner much earlier, as for some of the reasons that we're going to talk about later. So here are some basic tenets regarding life care plans. They're standardized processes. Life care planning actually developed out of case management, medical, psychological, and rehabilitation foundations. Understanding that this is a multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach, it takes a lot of people and resources to help treat somebody who has a significant injury. Well, for most of us, it takes a lot of people and resources for us just to get through our daily lives. But they're standardized processes. There's no one person that can do a life care plan. We rely on consistent methodologies to establish reliable and valid findings. We'll talk about those. Life care plans are prospective. So recommendations are based on probability of success. So in legal cases, there's usually some definition of that as more likely than not. When we're dealing with insurance companies or for other purposes we're doing life care plans, there may be different criteria. Life care plans are predictive. What is likely to happen into the future and why? And the recommendations are based on preventative modeling and proactive approaches versus reactive recommendations. Much more concerned that a person who's going to be bedridden for a long time has the proper bed with the proper turning procedures, the proper nursing care and everything like that, rather than having to talk about what to do when somebody is discovered with a stage 4 decubiti. We carefully link recommendations to patient and family clinical interviews and history. I'll talk about the interviews in a little bit of time, but this has to relate to the individual. It's not just review of a couple of records. Recommendations are typically supported with appropriate clinical practice guidelines and research literature. Life care planners should be aware of the case and understand the particulars, but a lot of times this is about working with the treaters or the experts or other people making recommendations to make sure that they're making their recommendations with the certainty and the criteria that the court or whatever other deliberative body is going to require. And ultimately, life care plans are designed to answer questions, not to raise them, to educate regarding disability, lifespan, and effective approaches. I might be hired by a defense attorney, I might be hired by a plaintiff attorney in legal cases, but my ultimate job and my ultimate role as an independent expert in the case is to educate the court or the decision makers who are involved. So this is not the orienting question for a life care plan. This is a question that I get asked a lot: how much is all these services going to cost? And that's part of the product. But life care plans are based on needs rather than funding to drive the planning process. We have to see what it is. Some people will say, Doc, I need $1 million life care plan, or I only need this or that. And the issue is we have to do the full assessment. We have to identify what it is. What money might be available subsequently is an issue for deliberation. But if if there was a very catastrophic injury that looked like it was going to take lots and lots of money, and I'm told, well, I've only got $2 million, well, that's your issue. My issue is I have to give you the full report, and you're going to have to make those decisions later. In some cases, when those types of life care plans have been done by others, they miss the big picture and they miss the big issue. So what we're asking about is what remedies are available to ameliorate or moderate documented adverse changes as a result of the sentinel event presently and in the predictive future. Again, we'll talk about predictive futures. So this is not the basis for a life care plan. Hey, doc, I've got somebody in a motorized wheelchair and I need the life care plan on them. All I see here is a wheelchair and a person. This doesn't tell me anything about the person. It doesn't tell me about their social support systems or where they live or what they do. It doesn't tell me about their premorbid status. So perhaps the person already had ambulatory disabilities. Maybe the person was experiencing disability due to paraplegia before and already has some cost associated with mobility. In that case, if now because of increased damage and things like that, they're going to need a more comprehensive or expensive wheelchair. I'm not going to give you the price for the full wheelchair. I'm going to deduct whatever the person's premorbid status was with various issues. Now, talking about premorbid issues, this definition or this qualification sometimes is as clear as it gets, but these issues may or may not be exclusionary, or they may be associative to the presenting problem. That's often an issue that comes up in court or in depositions or discussions. And we have to take a look at it. It may be the case that this person had this problem before and was being treated. It might be a case that a person had some premorbid issue before that wasn't an issue, but now it is. So consider somebody who has type 1 diabetes who requires insulin and diet management and was able to do that before, but now because of problems of attention and concentration can't do it. We may have to address that issue in a life care plan. It takes very careful vetting of all of this information. And we also have to look when there are premorbid issues, the relativity or equivalency of symptoms or function or the like. I'm a psychologist. A lot of times we run into situations where a person now needs psychological treatment for depression. Well, the history shows that they saw a psychologist once before when they were depressed. Well, was it an equivalent type issue, or a lot of people will see psychologists or counselors over their lives for different reasons? Were the symptoms the same? Did it affect functioning the same or not? These are all important questions that we have to take a look at and understand. So one template that I like to use in putting together a life care plan and understanding the individual is this from the World Health Organization about 20 years ago. They've come up with fancier ones, but this really gets to the issue. We need to take a look at impairment. What is the actual cellular damage or pathology as a result of the index event? Now, the presence or absence of that is one issue. These things interact with each other. As a result of impairment, what is disability, which is the effect on function, and then ultimately what is handicapped or the social disadvantage the person faces. So in essence, how does identified loss and change in impairment and associated functioning, how does that affect a person's daily life? And then the question of the life care plan is to find out from people who are treating the person or who've evaluated the person how to overcome and manage these types of issues. So let's start with functional capacity and let's talk about impairment and disability. So we can talk about functional capacity relative to medical issues, physical, psychological, and other issues. So this is demonstration of impairment. You can clearly see a damaged spinal cord here. And so we've identified impairment. Obviously, in many cases, you will not have as illustrative or as convincing information as in this case. There may be different types of information, but remember what it says at the bottom of every CT scan, MRI scan, X-ray, or a lot of other lab tests. Clinical correlation is required. Just because a radiograph or some test shows an abnormality, we still have to determine if there is disability or not. There are a lot of people going around with abnormal CT scans or other types of issues that are not demonstrating disability. So we have to tie this issue of impairment along with disability, which is taking a look at a function as it relates to some standardized test or population or something to see if the person is within the range or outside of the range of what she or he were like before. So this shows function, but in order to truly understand the nature of your client and the nature of the case, we have to involve aspects of context. We have to take a look at these various issues. Again, two people with a similar impairment may have very different needs because of who they are. What's their gender? What's their age? What's their perspective? What's their culture? What's their outlook on life? And what's happened to them in the past? It's going to make significant changes. What type of environment do they live in? And how does that allow or prevent access to resources that they may need over time? And what are some customary care issues that are there? What is their level of living? And this is not to talk about financial disparities, but let's say, for example, that we have to do significant home modifications for somebody who now has quadriplegia and is in a chair and the like. Well, for the house in the lower left-hand corner, we can probably talk about doing some remodeling. If the person is living in a house like in the upper right-hand corner, I know that pushes it a little bit, but you're probably going to have to take a look at other alternatives to doing some housing modifications. So we need to understand those types of things. What is the person's productive activity pattern? Is it relevant to their age? Is it relevant to how it supports them? But we're not only talking about vocational productivity patterns, we're also talking about recreational activities, family relationships, and a whole wide range of issues. Tying all that in is the third circle of the Venn diagram of lifespan, past, present, and future. Where is this person in their lifespan? What preserved skills do they have, or what are they missing? What's their life expectancy of how long they're going to live? And we can tie these three circles into what I call a qualitative association of how all these things come together. Now, no good medical presentation is worth its while unless there's a quote from Hippocrates. So he didn't understand life care planning 2,400 years ago, but he surely got the essence of a life care plan in its representation. It's far more important to know what person the disease has than what disease the person has. As a result of the disease, as a result of the index event, how has this affected the total person, and what is needed to help try to approximate what that person was like before? This is functional capacity. I can get you a cost for this wheelchair. Doesn't tell me very much except that somebody needs a wheelchair. This is Hippocrates. This is qualitative association. What I need to know is Grandpa used to go fishing with his grandson and no longer can. What supports and treatments are necessary to restore that productivity pattern to the person and the quality of life and the like. So it's not just about vocational issues, it's about many issues in people's lives. So when we talk about life care planning, it's a transdisciplinary process, and it requires drawing upon multiple specialties to obtain the necessary answers. There may be one life care planner pulling this all together, but it requires input from a tremendous number of people, and there's a tremendous amount of information that's required. I want to go through these 9 different essential life care planners, spend a couple of minutes on it, and then we can go back into some other areas. So the first thing is a comprehensive review of all evaluee records. You can see here, medical, psychological, rehabilitation. I need those if I'm the life care planner, whoever the person is, and I need them as soon as you have them, because it helps to understand who this person was before, what happened at the time of the index event, and I'm talking about damages. Life care planners typically don't get into liability. And then in terms of what the predictive future is based on the assessments, tests, and evaluations that have occurred. Biggest problem and a big cost increase in life care plans is when someone decides, oh, this isn't important for the life care planner to have, and all of a sudden it is, and the whole life care planner has to be changed. Or the biggest problem is they're not provided to the life care planner, and they're not discovered until by opposing counsel on deposition or in trial. Well, that causes problems. A comprehensive on-site interview of the evaluee and supports. If a picture's worth 1,000 words, the visit's worth thousands of pictures. This ties into context so much because you need to see where the person lives, how they live, the interaction, the areas around, and more likely than not, when I come back from an on-site interview, I've got more information than the attorney had before. Now, it's not always possible to do these on-site interviews. Sometimes opposing counsel will prevent it from occurring for whatever strategic issues it might be. There may be persons incarcerated or medically fragile. But This is the standard. I've heard some people say, well, can't you do a telephone call or a Skype? It's not the same. It's the difference between looking at that piece of chocolate cream pie in a magazine and having it in front of you. We need to have direct contact with everybody who's involved in the case, physicians, therapists, treatment teams, whoever. It's not just enough to look at the reports. The reports provide some information, but for the articulation that we need in the life care plan tables, I need to talk to people. Now, some life care planners will prefer to send letters, and I've done that at times, but I'd rather talk face-to-face with each person because it removes ambiguity. It gives much more precision to the recommendations that are there. And it helps to address hearsay issues in terms of, well, you have this in the life care plan, where did you get the information? And so the way that information is documented is critical to that, and it helps to qualify the experts making the recommendations. I'm going to get that into a minute. Some treaters may do this freely, others may charge for their time. The other thing, it takes time, so when you're thinking about putting together the life care plan, think about how long it sometimes takes, especially with all respect, to getting a hold of an orthopedic surgeon or a neurosurgeon or some other people. It may take a month or two just to set up the appointments. So let time be on your side rather than fighting it. Now, in terms of the issues, in terms of qualifying experts, there's a couple things that you're going to have to help with. First of all, you're going to have to explain to the life care planner and all the other people involved in a forensic case, what are the evidentiary requirements? Is it Fry, Daubert, hybrid, or something else? We need to know, and we need to know up front. And then also, the other issue is in talking to people and getting their opinions, I can take a look at their qualifications, and you need to understand the qualifications of each of your experts as well. It's too easy for experts to give opinions outside of their academic, professional, license, or other qualifications. And if you do that, at least parts of the life care plan or your case going to be impeached. There's a wonderful edition of the Journal of Life Care Planning. It was the first edition in 2019 that discusses the concept of transdisciplinary life care planning, and there are a number of articles. I don't know how clearly you can see this, but it talks about what life care planners need to know about different disciplines like physical therapy, physiatry, psychology, registered nurse, and like. Talks about the training, but it also talks about some of the areas where people might be qualified to make recommendations. As a psychologist, for example, if I see a person who's having problems articulating speech and that stuff, I'd feel fairly comfortable saying this person probably needs to be evaluated by a speech therapist. But I have no capacity to recommend the specific therapies that might be determined otherwise. So life care planners can independently make some of the recommendations, and they seek recommendations from others accordingly. The technique that I use is, after talking to the expert or the treater on the phone, and I explain this ahead of time, I put together a confirming services letter. And in that, and I explain to them, I'm going to send you each point or each recommendation that you gave me on this call. I want to make sure that I have it correct and it properly represents your opinions. That's what I'm trying to get, is your opinions. So I'll send them maybe a 3-page confirming services letter. It might go on for longer, whatever. But for each recommendation, the individual I'm talking to initials and dates it if they agree with it, they modify it or change it accordingly. But that gives me a basis for the life care plan. And anything that goes into a life care plan table that I produce, there's a corresponding written authorization by each person involved in the case. Sometimes there's going to be holes in a life care plan or a case. And again, if there's time, if you've involved the life care planner earlier, you can use it. There may be times that consulting specialists or other evaluations might be needed to clarify recommendations. Life care plans are constructed with glue, not spackling compound. Run into a situation, well, hey, there isn't a vocational evaluation, or this person is having this specific issue which was not adequately addressed, and the question will be, well, can't Dr. So-and-so say this, or can't somebody else recommend it? Or you're a psychologist, you understand the stresses of work. Can't you make recommendations about the person's vocational future? Well, I might opine those at times clinically, but definitely not forensically. So we have to sometimes bring these people in and consider who those people are going to be. The fifth essential LCP Foundation recommendation is drawing direct links between medical and rehabilitation records with recommendations in the life care plan. We need to know that they fit. If you do this, you'll avoid the piano problem. Doctor, will I be able to play the piano when you take the cast off? Of course, says the doctor. That's great because I could never play the piano before. That's a big problem. It's also a time to take a look at what the recommendations are like. For example, in a 24-hour day, are there 27 hours of therapy being recommended? So we really need to take a look at these things in the process of developing a life care plan. Referencing clinical practice guidelines and research literature, preferably by the qualified experts and treaters who are making the recommendations. They know specifically their craft, their profession, and the guidelines. I might appreciate that an MRI says that this person has a severed spine at the at the T4 region or something like that, but I surely don't know how to calibrate an MRI machine or how to read the information. But relative to the standards of evidence that are required in the case, we want to make sure that the experts are using or referring to this according to the needs. In some cases, it's just going to be, most frequently are common practices. In other cases, they'll be higher Daubert standards or others. Now, sometimes the expert's not there, or there's something that's obvious, or we can't get the information, and so somebody who is not qualified in the area will refer to other clinical practice guidelines, and you have to do that with caveats and hesitation. So here's the VA and DoD practice guidelines for lower limb amputations, and they say right up front that this is based on the best information available. It's designed to provide information to assist decision making, but are not intended to define a standard of care and should not be construed as one. It's important that the person interpreting these standards understand them and understand the application. I've had chances to review opposing counsel life care plans where somebody totally unqualified actually had a case like this where I think it was a speech pathologist who was citing these guidelines because there wasn't a prosthetist involved in the case. Now, that's a more egregious example, but those are some of the things that you have to take a look at. You have to make sure that people are qualified. Now we get into one of the bases in terms of identifying clinically relevant and geographically accessible resources and valid charges of individual plan needs. So this is a critical issue, and we have to understand it carefully. This might be empirically valid. There's a wheelchair for sale in Glen Allen on Craigslist for $40, but it's not clinically or ecologically valid to the needs of the evaluee. So in determining costs, there's some best practices that we tend to rely on. Verifiable data from appropriately referenced and reliable sources and geographically specific resources when appropriate. My preference is to identify resources in the community or the geographic area, the direct providers that the evaluee may need based on the recommendations. That way I can find out if they're really there or not, or if the databases are usually a year or so delayed, so we don't know. Can also talk and find out if they treat people with the challenges that the evaluee is facing. There's like 54 or 56 different divisions in the American Psychological Association, so not all psychologists are going to be able to treat all cases. The same thing with speech pathology. In one case, I was finding some charges that seemed very low, and it turned out that these were speech pathologists working with children in elementary schools, and it wasn't for the person with the stroke that I was taking a look at and working with. More than one cost estimate when appropriate. Charges may vary over time, and we want to take a look at that. Sometimes one cost estimate may be all that's available or might be more appropriate, especially for people, for example, who have significant spinal cord injury and there have been multiple surgeries there, and there's a neurosurgeon who truly knows this person's spine, and they may be the best person to follow through. We can take a look at validating that their charges are similar, but we need to understand these parameters. Non-discounted and market rates. That is the preferred standard within the standards of practice of life care planning. This is the rate expressed on billing. It's specific, it's been a consistent indices, it's pretty transparent, it's available pretty easy by most people, and it's accessible. And there may be some different issues that go on in there, but we can usually identify them as well. So that's sort of the standard of care. I'm going to show you some other cost structures as well, but typically when life care planners are asked to provide another cost structure, we'll do life care planning table based on the charge rate, and then we'll do it on the others. So what are some of the other rates? We can talk about discount rates, but they vary across parties and maybe used as a loss leader to recruit business. So if you base it on a discount rate that then changes down the road, the evaluee is not going to have the funds necessary to continue the treatment and supports. Insurance reimbursement rates vary widely. Insurers vary to size, discounts, is proprietary information. Don't have a chance to go through all this information, but at the very bottom of this slide is the website to www.lawrencelivness.com. Lance has been in the field for decades and in the insurance industry. He works evaluating benefits and cases. He keeps telling me he's retired, but every time I call him back, well, almost and not quite. But he lists 39 different types of in-kind contractual benefits that might be associated with insurance payments that we can't capture on life care plans. So we have to take a look at that. Non-insured private rate, it's a new classification, and some places are offering discounts, but again, this is new. It's not consistent across providers. We don't have enough time to determine durability and the like. And then there's government rates like Medicare and Medicaid. It's usually reimbursement below the cost of service provision. It may only be for a certain amount of services, or the accessibility to care providers will vary. Though in some states it may be required. A colleague of mine in California told me, in at least in the one court where she was going to present a life care plan, that the judge was mandating not only the charge rate, but wanted to know what all the rates were based on Medi-Cal reimbursement. So we need to understand these things, and we need to go forward with this information. There's also the issue, especially with durable medical equipment or transportation, about replacement schedules, excuse me for a sec, or maintenance contracts and the like. Well, there's some peer-reviewed research on it. Dr. Mariani and his associates have published several times in Journal of Life Care Planning, but we can also look to trade groups, we can look to manufacturers and others to get this information as well. But we have to have a basis for those recommendations, not that it's just a good idea. So how do we pull all this information together? Well, we're going to put the summary information into a life care plan table, and I'm sure different life care planners have different ways of amalgamating the information. What I like to do is create what I call a data charge registry, and I'll show you a few pages from a sample. By the way, this information, most of the other information is based on a fictitious life care plan that I put together. Actually, some of the data charge registry information may be based on old cases from providers of these services. I don't know if they're still in operation or not, but we need the charge data registry so anybody who's reviewing the life care plan can go back and see the fundamentals of how this information was developed, and they can go back and see if it's reproducible or not. It's also important for the evaluee in many cases. Litigation takes a long time. A person may need services well before then, and they don't always have access to the resources. But if they do, it's important for them to know what the steps are. So just really quickly, here's an example in northern New York State for restorative dental services. No, there aren't CPT codes here because the dentists up in that area don't do that, but we needed to find out about replacing crowns and implants. So now they can call Dr. Milton or Aspen Dental or the others and identify services, and they can also be verified by anybody who's evaluating the life care plan. Medications are easy to get, but we want to know whether you want label or you want generics, and that's up to the providers. I always contact at least 3 pharmacies. I always contact a Walmart pharmacy. Why? Because if I don't, I'm asked, why didn't you contact Walmart? There's an assumption that their prices are cheaper. That's not necessarily the case over time. But our job is to provide information for decision makers. So we're going to do this, and we're going to provide it in this way as well. Companion care, especially for people who are catastrophically injured, can be a big issue. So again, here's 4 companies that we looked at. Now the hourly charge will vary by the number of hours required, but by contacting these sources rather than looking at a database, you can actually find out if they work with the types of issues that the individual is facing. A lot of companion care is for aged people or bedridden people. So one of the first questions I addressed, especially when dealing with catastrophic brain injury with frontal lobe involvement, how good are you keeping up with a 28-year-old with frontal lobe impairment who's impulsive? We need to know. I want to also know how the people are being checked and monitored and how many people are going to be involved. You might be able to provide 24 hours of care from service, but the issue is every 4 hours it's going to be a different provider. There's not a lot of promise for that for consistency. Also, in some cases, if there's personal care attendant and wraparound services in a community setting, then you may have to take a look at the cost for that person to be in that setting. So this was a person in a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment. Well, they were going to get 24-hour services, so we had to take a look at the additional costs of an additional bedroom and bathroom to house the personal care attendants, not necessarily even if they were staying overnight, but there needed to be a place for records and other things like that to look at. This is just a lab test. In this case here, we're not using the actual service providers in the area because lab tests have been more nationalized, but so we're using some other references such as physician's fee reference and medical fees, two well-regarded books, and we're taking a look at certain levels of reimbursement, and we're also looking at geographic adjustment by CPT codes. Here's an example of how we combined information. Sometimes you can't get consistent sources of information for a question. This was a case of an individual living in Louisiana who had multiple spinal injuries and was going to require a number of fusions, as you can see in the upper left-hand side. And he was being treated by a neurosurgeon there. So we contacted the neurosurgeon's office, who intimately knew this person and knew this person's back and spine. And so we were able to deduce what the charges were going to be for the 3-level ACDF and the fusions and the 1-level ACDF. Now, the issue is this person used to live in Oakland, California. There was a strong possibility they'd be moving back there. While we could get the cost for neurosurgeon office visits from several places, you know, no neurosurgeon is going to give you specifics of the surgeries because they don't know what the person looks like. So we went to a number of different databases through the American Hospital Directory, Fair Health, and others to get that information. So you'll see differences in the charges. Most of those are geographically based, but it's always important to understand and to present the basis for your information so that other people can make decisions about it. Really quickly, on issues of transportation, transportation is not transportation. Here's a case with someone who has catastrophic injuries, who was requiring a lot of supports. They were going to continue to live at home, but they were going to require a lot of OT and PT speech and evaluations. And you can see in the left-hand column at the top or at the bottom, the various different disciplines that are going to be required. And the frequency of those visits or that treatment was going to change over the person's lifetime. So we took a look at how frequent the trips were going to be or the visits were going to be in the first year, the second year, then years 3 through 65, and subsequently, as you can see. And we had the charges for each of those trips because we took a look at the sources that we used for the evaluations, and we averaged it out on MapQuest of how much a round trip was, and then we determined mileage by looking at standards from Department of Transportation and the IRS. So we could understand that the first year the person was going to invoke about $3,600, almost $3,700 in mile charges, but over time it would titrate to about $1,400 as their needs decreased. Here's a case of a person who was pretty adept at getting around but couldn't drive. There was hope that they'd be able to drive future, but this person needed on-demand replacement travel. It wasn't about calling a handicap transportation service 3 days in advance. This was a smaller community. There were only 2 taxi cab companies, so we asked them what the cost was for a 10-mile trip and a 20-mile trip, and we averaged that out. And so we found it cost about $2.92 per mile for taxi cab services. According to the Department of Transportation published guidelines and the type of locality this person lived, the average driver drove 11,498 miles, told us that the person could use up to $33,500 a year in transportation. That didn't mean that they always were, but now we had the basis for making decisions and we could take a look at relative percentages. Maybe the person was able to drive all the time except for night and might need a little bit of time. What about Uber? What about Lyft? Well, sometimes we can take a look at that, but the issue with that is it's dynamic pricing. It changes at all times and with all drivers, and now Uber's actually experimenting with drivers being able to set rates. So it's not as predictable as this is. So that's the reason the taxi cab was used in this manner. Just one final issue about transportation. This was a younger child, was going to require a number of evaluations and treatment. It was necessary and important for the mother to be there for a number of different reasons, but the mother was going to have to take time off from work, so we computed wage replacement for what would be required for the mother to go to these visits with the child. The last essential LCP foundation I want to talk about is assuring procedural and organizational validity of the life care plan. Well, each different credentialing body for life care planners have standards of practice. There's some similarities between the three that I'll show you later, but so this is the face page of the most recent version of the International Academy of Life Care Planners Standards of Practice, and they're thematic. They talk about essential things that a life care planner needs to do in a case. These are, again, the standards that provide for the validity in court and other situations. But within this organization, of which I'm a member of, so I say that with all attributions and any perceived biases that people might have. But we also, on typically every 2 years, do what's called a consensus or life care planning summit to review these primary standards, and then to discuss what does it really mean in terms of how do you implement those in a consistent manner that represents the field and the specialty as a whole, and how do you address various issues. And then there's a special issue of the Journal of Life Care Planning that usually comes out, and there may be 100 or so consensus and majority statements that also guide the life care planners, as well as the standards of practice. But these statements are based on the standards of practice, so there's an internal and a functional consistency across these. Life care plans are going to be divided into many sections. I'm showing you 9 here. You can take a look at them, but you might ask, well, why did you put the evaluations in this section and the treatment in this section for the same provider? Well, that's just how it's set up for some consistency and to take a look at cost basis. It's also sometimes set up that way when we take a look at present value and in terms of economists, in terms of different types of issues as well. But these 9 different life care plans sections evolve into about 19 different domains. You can see here projected evaluations, therapeutic modalities, issues about ambulation and wheelchairs, ortheses and prostheses as needed, home modifications, and a whole list of things. So usually most of the things that a person might require are covered in these domains, and if not, we can create another domain. But again, we're trying to maintain consistency so that everybody can understand the information and it can be consistent in its education. So what I want to do really is show you a little bit about reports. Now, this is a critical area of communication between the life care planner and the attorney, because the information may have to be represented in the courts differently. In some cases, the only thing that may be required is an expert disclosure along with the life care plan tables. In other cases, the courts or the attorney or the deliberative body might want a really detailed report going through and reviewing all the information. Now, that doesn't remove the life care planner from doing all the steps that we've talked about, but the manner in which it's represented is going to be based on who the ultimate client is. Again, we're talking of forensic issues, but there may be different recommendations in trust accounts or insurance companies and the like. So this, again, is a fictitious life care plan that I've put together. Sometimes people want to see something or understand it better. All the information is fictitious. Even Nokesville, Kentucky, where Martin Keyes lives, doesn't exist in Kentucky, at least as far as I know. So in this case here, this is a pretty extensive life care plan. Here's a table of contents of plan. The report runs about 52 pages because it really reviews the treatment records, educational and work histories, the interviews with Mr. Keyes, his wife, and other collateral sources. In this case here, there was some psychological assessment that was supposedly requested. So here's the results of some of that information as well. And then this goes on. I mean, this is just the first page. We're going to skip it. But so that's one life care plan report. Again, they're going to vary. They're going to vary according to the needs and the demands or the criteria of the deliberating bodies. Let the life care planner know about this ahead of time, because it could save a lot of time. It could save a lot of money if all of a sudden a report's been put together one way because there hasn't been communication, and then, oh no, we have to change the whole thing. There's a lot of water under the dam. Life care plan tables are one of the critical things everybody wants to know, because that talks about the charges and the costs. We've talked about the context and everything before, so this is just my face page of a life care plan table. We start with projected evaluations. Well, the first evaluation is the life care plan itself that we complete, but I'm just going to show you a couple of pages. We're not going to go through. So here's a continuation of projected evaluations. So in this case here for Mr. Keys, physiatry, neurology, and psychiatry were recommended as one-time evaluations before Mr. Keys went into treatment. Neuropsychology was going to vary between 3 and 6 times over his lifespan, depending on whether he was under a guardianship or not. So after the frequency, there's a purpose for why these services or services required. There's charge data. So here we have per unit. And then we might either have the total, like if there's only one physiatry visit, it's total cost of $250. In other cases, we may show a range. Sometimes that range will be talked about on an annual cost. So if there's going to be $18,000 in neuropsychology charges over Mr. Key's lifespan, and he has a 36-year life expectancy, sometimes we'll talk about it as $500 a year. Sometimes we'll put it this way and let the economists take a look at this information to make a determination. Any comments about the service are noted, and then in the right-hand column, the only people who show up in there are the people who have made the recommendations, and their recommendations, at least in the life care plans that I do, are on those confirming services letters. Sometimes we're not able to do that. Sometimes we have to take the information from a report because the expert wasn't available or for some other reasons or something like that. But the standard, at least that I go by, is if it's not written down, if there's not a written down recommendation, a precise recommendation, it's not going to go into the table. The other thing is that we put in the tables are those things that meet the professional certainty within the jurisdiction. So in most states in the union, professional certainty is more likely than not. It varies in some states and things like that, but the life care plan tables are talking about professional certainty or medical certainty. Here's just another table with a 3-level ACDF, and it's not just the cost of the surgery, but what are the pre-surgical preparations, post-surgical treatments and meds. The next page of this would have showed you durable medical equipment or other things that are required over time. So again, each thing by itself needs to be identified again by who it's recommended. In this case, the neurosurgeon. There's summary pages. So in the example I showed you, there were actually 25 pages of individual life care plan tables, and now here there's 7 summary pages. So this is the first one. Mr. Keys, in this case, is going to require residential treatment for the initial year, and then he might go on to assisted living, or he might go living at home with wraparound services. So again, here's a summarization of all the services continued on the next page that he's going to need in year 1. Right above there, you'll see life expectancy. In this case, there's 35 additional years projected for Mr. Keys. Now, life expectancy is an interesting thing and may go many different ways. Sometimes a physician or medical expert will project a life care or a life expectancy for a person. And if they do, that's usually the life expectancy that I'm going to use unless there's some disagreement between people, and I might use a range. Typically, when there's not such recommendation, most life care planners will go to a government source. In this case here, this is from the CDC, the National Vital Statistics Reports, and they're representing, in this case, that based on his age at the time of the life care plan report, Mr. Key has a life expectancy of 35 years. Now, that's the median life expectancy. That means that there's a 50% chance he'll live less or he'll live longer. So that may be a discussion that needs to be had. Here's a summary page later. So we're finishing up here. The second option, which years 2 or 3 of his life, he's in a community-based in-home program. There's some various services, the charges that there's some additional evaluations that Mr. Keys is going to need regardless of where he's living. There's the issue of for guardianship of what it costs to establish it. So you'll see a low and a high range between $3,500 and $80,000. Well, that depends if it's a non-contested or a contested guardianship. There's a summary page of the charges, the ultimate charges. There's usually a qualification, for example, cost of trust management or whatever, depending on the case. And then sometimes, in most cases, we'll also include a final page on the life care plan tables for potential complications. These are things that the treater or expert or something says, you know, Dr. Jacobs, this doesn't reach the professional certainty required in this case, but I'm really clinically concerned about this. If I'm treating this person, I'm going to be looking out for these things because there's a significant chance, again, that's less than medical certainty, that the person might need treatment. In this case, Mr. Keys might be prone to hydrocephalus, dementia, severe psychiatric or behavioral decompensation, repeat neurosurgical interventions. So we'll talk about the general cost of such complications, comment on some of the reasons, and maybe even provide some references as necessary or as provided. And this might be something that also needs to be discussed. So you have the final tabulation in the life care plan tables, but there may be other costs that you may need to consider as well. So engaging a life care planner. So these are some of the really critical issues. Engage the life care planner early. You can engage them directly as a life care planner, or you might engage them as a case consultant. You may say, hey, I've got this case and I need somebody to sort of take a look at it. And would you be willing to do that? Some life care planners will, with the understanding and the retainer agreement that I'm just a case consultant, I'm not doing a life care plan at this point in time. Some might not, because it might exclude them from the case, and there may be some interest on the other side of engaging them as a life care planner. But get somebody involved early, because these people have experience with the types of cases that you're dealing with, and they have a means, if they're well trained and experienced, of accessing and talking to the various professionals and providers in a way that other people don't, because they know the lingo. They've done these cases before. They've been involved. Establish clear timelines for all parties and expectations. So litigation is an arduous process, and it keeps going on forever and changes all the time, but we have to have some ideas ahead of time. When are reports required? What's the discovery process like? When is the period of anticipated depositions or trial? Knowing it's going to change. So that way the life care planner can set their schedule accordingly, but the life care planner should also tell you about how busy they are, so that you know and you feel comfortable that they have the time to meet these needs. These things are going to change, but we have to set these up. Understand the process and fundamentals and standards of practice in life care plans, as we talked about before, making all records available. You're not going to have all the records at the beginning when you engage a life care planner, but as you get them, bring them in. Also understand that some of those records are the expert and treater reports. And you have to give the life care planner time after they receive those reports to complete their life care plan. A lot of times, experts or treaters are not willing to talk to people until they've completed their report for a variety of reasons. So then it's going to take time to make contact with these people and get their information as well. So get those records as soon as possible. Ensure life care planner contact with the evaluee. Ensure the communication between the life care planner and the experts and providers. We're going to talk about focusing on the training, credentialing, experience of the life care planner in a minute, but as you can see by the bottom, I have an urgency about communication. Communication is key to life care planning, is to get all this information together, and so that you're doing it in a deliberative process and it doesn't become a frustrating process of trying to hoard cats. That's not going to turn out well for anybody. But communication is critical. So sometimes attorneys communicate directly, sometimes they provide a paralegal or somebody else in their office. Make sure that that person is up on the case so they can communicate, and make sure that there's a phone an attorney button or phone a friend button available, so if the life care planner is really not feeling comfortable about something, that you or your associates can be involved. So in issues of credentialing, it turns out that there's no licensure to be a life care planner in any state in the union. And there are people who present life care plans in court without such certification. But more likely than not, you need to understand that the person that you hire as a life care planner is going to be held to those standards of practice. And so you really want to take a look at who that person is. There are currently 3 major life care planning certification boards that I know of. The International Academy of Life Care Planners was one of the earliest ones. The American Association of Nurse Life Care Planners, and then the American Academy of Physician Life Care Planners. They all have standards of practice, some which are complementary. In some cases, there's a little bit of differentiation between them. They all follow certain standards in terms of hours of training and field experience and demonstration of competency and board certifications required. So let's get into some common pitfalls and wrap up this discussion. Then I'm happy to take questions for as long as you wish. So your pitfalls are waiting too long to engage a life care planner, poor communication, the timeliness of data, disregarding standards of practice, or the life care planner as an independent expert. I get this occasionally. Well, why do you have to review the files? 3 other physicians and 2 other people have reviewed the files. Because I'm an independent expert. You don't want me killed by hearsay. I don't want to be killed by hearsay, and I need to understand the information. Lack of clarity for standards of admissibility in jurisdictions, courtrooms, whoever the decision-making process is. Expert qualifications relative to specific recommendations. No life care planner is an island. No discipline is universal. I've seen life care plans thrown out because a couple of experts went beyond their expertise. I've seen it situations where a life care planner says, I don't need to talk to anybody because I'm a physician or I'm this or that, and they're making all the recommendations. There's some cases, I'm not going to bring up specific cases out of deference to some of the people in them, but where a life care planner came to court and opposing counsel challenged the life care planner's applicability to present it, because even though this person was a physician, they were making recommendations about surgery, but they're not trained as a surgeon, or they were making recommendations about frequency of psychotherapy, though they weren't trained as a psychotherapist. Long story short, the person was removed from the case with their report. On top of that, the next motion was to remove the economist, because the economist report was based on the life care plan, which had now been impeached. It wasn't a good day in court for some people. Unqualified treatments, these things might sound speculative. There needs to be some basis for them. Hearsay, there's a number of issues with hearsay. I talked about some of them today, about how a life care planner collects and reports data. Also, order of case testimony. I've been told by several attorneys that the life care planner should go last in court, especially after the experts, so that the life care planner is not making a recommendation for the treatment that the decision makers, the jury or judge, haven't heard. That's hearsay, and that can cause complications. And then you need to vet the life care planners for financial or institutional bias to make sure of who you're working with and who's going on. There have been past life care planners who has discovered they were making recommendations for their own programs or other associations, and that caused a lot of problems. Non-life care plans, so you don't always need to do a full life care plan. You may need information for mediation. We can do cost analyses at times where we may look at less information. The decision may be made by both parties. Well, we're going to rely on the recommendations of these experts, and so the life care planner will contact those experts for the recommendations, will not go through all the deliberative processes, will go through clear processes for determining costs and come up with a report. But most of those reports and in retainer contracts will say this is only for the purpose of mediation or non-court determination, and this will not be defended in court. And the life care planner is also likely to say, if this goes to court, I need to do a full life care plan. So some of the other names below are similar types of approaches, and these can be valid at times. You just need to know. The issue is, well, only 5 or 10% of all cases end up going to court. We don't always know which 5 or 10% there are. Finally, the minimum life care plan is an oxymoron. It's fake. A life care planner is responsible for identifying the needs of a person and not minimizing those needs or expanding or exploiting those needs, but there's a life care plan. And this life care plan has to follow standards of practice. A couple of references, if you don't have them: 2 books, Life Care Planning and Case Management. It's in the 4th edition, edited by Roger Reed and Deborah Behrens. It's very comprehensive and also covers a number of chapters in terms of legal issues as well. And then the corresponding Pediatric Life Care Planning and Case Management book that's edited by Susan Riddick Grisham and Laura Deming. Peer-reviewed journals in the field. Journal of Life Care Planning is associated with the International Academy of Life Care Planning. And then there's Nurse Life Care Planning, which is peer-reviewed journal for the American Association of Nurse Life Care Planners. There are others available as well. I'm sorry I took a lot of time. I hope I answered some questions. I'm happy to stay here and answer more questions if you have them, and I'm going to turn it back to Kyle. Thank you very much.
Great. Dr. Jacobs, thank you so much. So at this time, we're going to open it up to some Q&A. So if you have questions, please go ahead and post them to the chat, and we'll stick around and answer any questions. Dr. Jacobs will answer any questions that you may or may not have that you don't feel like got addressed. Certainly you have the direct contact here for Dr. Jacobs. So if there's something you want to talk offline with him about, certainly he's provided you all of his contact information to approach him directly. So
please feel free to contact me. I also have other information and materials that I couldn't put in this plan, and sample reports and the like. So, feel free to reach out as you like.
I did want to touch on one thing because it's a question that I get, and maybe you could kind of articulate. I know you had touched a little bit on engaging a life care planner, but I guess a lot of what we get is, well, here's a question, Harvey. Do you do nationwide life care plans?
I do life care plans around the country, and depending on the nature of the plan and what's involved. But yeah, I have Delta, United, Southwest. They all know me well.
We got another question. Because you like to actually see the client, how do you facilitate the patient interview process?
Well, it starts very, very early in the process. I'm going to get the contact information. If it's a plaintiff attorney who's hired me, I'm going to have the contact information. I will have explained this to the attorney. They may contact their client ahead of time to say that Dr. Jacobs is going to be contacting you, and I try to reach the client. And I see Dylan Pollard says when the client is out of state, I'll go there. I go to where the person is. It's really important to see the person in the context of where they're living and the people around them. And so it may take a couple of days to do that. Yes, there is an additional cost to that, but you can't get the information really any other way. When you're talking to somebody on the phone or Skype and all that stuff, you just don't see it accordingly. On occasion, if retained by defense, a plaintiff life attorney or a plaintiff's attorney may not want the defense retained life care planner to go see their client. There may be some strategic issues or other issues. That's not my job. I'm not going to get into that issue. As I explained to people, my job is to provide some objective data for people to make determinations for. I'm not going to get, someone says, well, you don't put your dog in that fight. And I say, no, I don't. But so we'll try. I mean, maybe there's some conditions that allow me to go in and see the person. There may be some other criteria that is not like the ecologically natural assessment that might occur on the other side. I'm going to take what I can get, and I'm going to report accordingly. And if I'm reviewing a life care plan and from the other side, and that person didn't do the evaluation or they couldn't or whatever, well, did they identify that? Did they also identify the potential vulnerabilities associated with that? So no, I know that this person lives in such and such a town, and I've seen it on National Geographic. I'm being a little bit facetious right now. But I don't know. I mean, because you find these things out where you go. So you have to represent the information you have. You have to represent the data as you have it, and it has to be transparent because your job is to educate all parties. My job is not to make decisions about the outcome of a case. It's to present the information for whatever parties and modalities are being used, have good, valid information to make those determinations.
Good deal. Thank you. So I got another question from Paul Kaufman. If the client has only chronic pain needing pain management with only mild functional impairment, client can work, drive, do activities of daily living, but not the same recreation as before, would that merit a life care plan?
Well, I guess it would depend on the nature of your case. And there would probably be a lot of considerations involved. But the person who could tell you about the services or treatments that your client needs is going to be the pain management specialist, whoever else is treating them. And so if it's a case with lower pay, with lower amounts of money for reimbursement and that stuff, you might rely on the physician or maybe somebody else to make some recommendations, and then you might get a life care planner or somebody else to put some costs together and to present that to opposing counsel. You might take it a step further up and have somebody an occupational therapist or even a recreational therapist or somebody in terms of looking at assessing a person's capacities in these areas and what they might need, and you might add that as well. So again, you don't need a life care plan for all cases. I mean, on a large case that's out of town, and not all life care plans involve one person. There may be a group of people who were injured. Now, there'll be individual life care plans for one person, but that group is also looked as a group as a whole. So these are important questions to ask any life care planners, as you're contacting them. This is what I'm looking at. This is what I need. And I think the life care planners also have to offer you options and some of their opinions of what may be the benefits or deficits of such approaches.
Dr. Jacobs, I'm wondering, just your experience up to this point. Do you tend to see in your own practice cases with a particular type of injury? Is it see a lot more quadriplegic cases or spinal cord injuries or brain injury type cases?
A lot of my work has involved people with neurologic impairment, and so I did some of the earliest work and continue to do a lot of work in acquired and traumatic brain injury. But I also have worked on cases with spinal cord injury. There have been cases with amputation. My early training in behavioral psychology, a lot of the things that I was doing early on was dealing with people with severe behavior dysfunction. A lot of times people talk about behavior disorder, but I talk about dysfunction because there's always a reason why a person is acting that way. And actually, that's how I got into working in traumatic brain injury in the early days of the field. I was getting referred young adults, primarily males, who were doing fine before a car crash. Nobody understood why. And so as we understood the reasons, we did that. So there are a diversity of things. I try to stay within a pattern of the clinical work that I currently do or I've done in the past. I've done pediatric work or worked across the lifespan. But I had an interesting thing where an attorney once hired me to do some cases that involved acquired brain injury due to carbon monoxide poisoning. And I guess the attorney was pleased because a year later said, look, I've got this burn case and I really want you to do it. And I said, that's not my specialty. And the attorney said, well, they probably inhaled some smoke. And so there's probably some level of brain injury. No, you need to identify what you do and where you can work at.
Good to know. Good to know. I think you addressed one of the questions I had, which was that we get a lot from attorneys we work with around the country, and that's what's the appropriate case? I think everybody's looking for that sweet spot to bring in a life care planner. So some absolutely think on the $1 million, big catastrophic commercial case, they need a life care planner. But you have people with serious injuries, and like you said, sometimes there are just financial restrictions, and does it warrant a life care planner? So,
well, it doesn't cost much to call one and ask them and talk to them a bit, and to know, because quite frankly, I don't want to overdo something in a case. I don't want to impede or take money that's important in the case, regardless of whether the attorney's representing defense or plaintiff. And a discussion can help to identify some of those issues. I've had that at times, and it really helps. It's when you don't ask, and until later, that the problems run, and they run for everybody. So I recommend, if you've got a case and there's some things and you're talking to some people and it looks like there may be some things, get a hold of a life care planner or talk to somebody, say, hey, I've got this case and I'm just trying to talk a little bit. Now, different life care planners will talk at different levels in terms of, a lot of them will say, I don't want to know anything about the specifics of the case because I don't want to now have an association with one side or the other. But they can at least talk to you about some of the issues. And like in this question here from Paul Kaufman, well, this is a chronic pain. These are a few things, and I might recommend some modalities or some approaches. I don't want to know he or she or what the pain is or those types of things, but we want to make sure that people have good information so that they can make good decisions about whether or not a person needs something, and if they do, what it is.
I think the last question that I've got, and then if we don't have any more questions, we'll wrap. So if we have, I think one of the other questions is, what role the attorney should be taking, and getting somebody like yourself involved with the treaters, that have been treating somebody. So like we have a brain injury facility, in Kentucky, Resilient Life Care. Is that, what's their role in getting you communicating with that particular organization?
And that's where a client is currently stationed?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, what needs to occur is the attorney to contact that facility. And also what I do is I'll be sending the attorney a number of release of information forms, so that either their client, or if the client's under guardianship or has some incapacity, the guardian or designated person for that individual will allow that communication for me to occur with that facility and the people in the facility. And the attorney might encourage the facility to talk with me, or send me some of the guidelines. But at that point, I want the communication to be between myself and the facility or the treater. Having an attorney involved in that communication sets up obvious problems later on in terms of independence of evaluation. Sometimes when I've gone on interviews to meet with the individual and that stuff, the attorney says, well, I'll just come to introduce you and so on. And I said, no, I really don't want that. I want to know where this person's at. And I mean, if we have to do some other things on introduction, I've usually have had a phone call with the individual or people in their support systems. I'll sometimes use Skype that way so they can see my face if they need to, or whatever. The funny thing I hear from people, because I'm coming to their houses to talk with them, is, I was really nervous. You're a doctor and you were coming to my house. Man, I cleaned up for a week, or I tried to, but I couldn't do it. But didn't need to do that. This was pretty comfortable. So you want to make that accessibility. You want to have the direct contact between the life care planner and whether it's the providers or treaters or the client and people, and let them do the work. Life care planners are trained to do that. They're all experienced in their field. I've worked in hospitals, rehab settings, community settings, private practices, government settings. I mean, a lot of life care planners are well attuned to the cultures and the communication and the other processes to make those things happen. If you get calls from somebody saying, hey, I've got this life care planner and they're making me uncomfortable, or I don't know this or that, or they're not responding to my calls and stuff like that, you need to have a conversation with your life care planner.
Understood. Okay, well, Ted, I don't think we have any other questions. Dr. Jacobs, we really appreciate the time today. I think it was more than informative. I know how valuable the time is, so we really appreciate you spending a little bit of time with everybody today and explaining, this in a lot more detail, and giving everybody a glimpse into what life care planning is about and how to access it and what to be on the lookout for. So we really appreciate it. And with that, we'll end this, and appreciate everybody joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.